Right, welcome back. But moving on to a set of muscles that will be located in the back of the thigh. We've got three muscles on here. We've got a muscle with two heads. One is superficial, the other one is deeper to it. And this muscle with its two heads, it's going to be located on the outside of the thigh, on the lateral aspect of the posterior side of the thigh. This is a muscle with two heads, so we call it the biceps. And it's located in the thigh, so we call this is my biceps femoris. Biceps femoris. Two other muscles located in the posterior aspect of the thigh. I have one with a very long tendon. Almost half of its length is a tendon. This is what we call the semitendinosus. Located deeper to it, so if I remove the semitendinosus, I will see a muscle which is flattened. Half of it, it's a membrane. It's a membrane-like muscle. It's flattened. This is called my semimembranosus. So again, what we're looking at in here, on the outside surface, on the lateral aspect of the posterior side of the thigh, we've got a muscle with two heads. This is going to be my biceps femoris. On the medial side, we've got semitendinosus, superficial, and deeper to it, you've got the semimembranosus. This is my semimembranosus on here. It's located deeper to the semitendinosus. If you notice on here, what's common in all those three muscles, they get their origin from the ischium, and they are inserted down in the leg, either for the semitendinosus, semimembranosus, they are inserted in the tibia, as it is the medial bone of the leg, or for the biceps femoris, as you see on here, it's going to be inserted with its two heads in the fibula. This is my biceps femoris. It's inserted down here in my fibula, compared to the semitendinosus, semimembranosus. Those are inserted in my tibia. So generally speaking, all the three muscles are getting their origin from the ischium and are going to be inserted in the leg. So they are passing posterior to the hip joint and posterior to the knee joint. So if I'm passing posterior to the hip joint, what action am I aiding in? I have a muscle on here. This is my hip joint. This is the thigh, like this. And this is my knee. So we're saying here, the hamstring group of muscles, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus, are getting their origin from the ischium and going to be inserted in my leg, either for the biceps in the fibula or the semitendinosus and semimembranosus in my tibia. So getting the origin here from the ischium and the insertion in the leg. So what's going to be the action of those muscles on both the hip joint and the knee joint. So if we're starting from this position of the hip joint, would I be pulling the thigh forward or backwards? What do you think? Backwards. I'm passing behind the hip. So I would be pulling, if I'm pulling this point towards this point, so the thigh is gonna be moving backwards. And as I move the thigh backwards, what's gonna happen to the angle of this joint, of the hip joint? See on here? I've got an increase in the angle of the joint. And when I increase the angle of the joint, we call this is an extension. So biceps femoris, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus are going to be performing extension of the thigh at the hip joint. And how about their action on the knee joint? What do you think? This is my knee joint on here. When I pull the leg backwards, see if this was the angle of the joint before I perform the contraction. Now this will be the angle of the knee joint. So what happened to the angle of the joint? It has been reduced. So what do we call the reduction in the angle of the joint along the sagittal plane? Remember, this is what we call flexion. So what is the action here of biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus? They are performing extension of the hip, flexion of the knee. And this is exactly the opposite of what we've seen back when we discussed the rectus femoris. Remember, rectus femoris was passing in front of the hip, in front of the knee. So it allowed flexion of hip and extension of the knee. So those three muscles are antagonists to the rectus femoris on both hip joint and knee joint. Looking here at another muscle, it's also going to be considered as one of the hamstring muscles, but it's not actually located in the back of the thigh. We call this muscle is my sartorius. 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 As you see, the sartorius gets its origin from the iliac bone, travels down and medially, passing behind the knee to be inserted in the tibia. So it's passing in front of the hip and behind the knee. So passing in front of the hip joint. Again, what's going to be my action if I'm passing in front of the hip joint? Passing in front of the hip joint. When I'm reducing the length of the muscle, passing in front of the hip joint, the hip would be moving forward, allowing flexion of the hip. And moving behind the knee joint, when I'm reducing the angle, when I'm reducing the length of the muscle, what's going to be the effect on the knee joint here? Flexion again. So Here the sartorius is doing what? It's doing flexion on both hip and knee. So let's summarize this part. So we've seen the rectus femoris. If you remember, it passes in front of the hip and in front of the knee joint. So I will put F for, or I'll put A for anterior, all right? So A here means anterior. So here I'm passing anterior to the hip, anterior to the knee. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, those are passing posterior to both hip and knee. Sartorius muscle, you see on here, it's passing in front of the hip and going posteriorly, going backwards to travel behind the knee. So I'm here passing anterior to the hip, posterior to the knee. So passing in front of the hip joint, anterior to the hip joint, what action would I be performing on the hip joint? It's going to be flexion. Passing posterior to the hip joint, what action would I be performing? Passing behind or posterior to the hip joint, I would be performing extension of the hip. How about passing anterior to the knee joint? Passing anterior to the knee joint. Passing anterior to the knee joint, you're going to be performing extension. How about passing posterior to the knee joint, you're going to be performing flexion of the knee. So if you notice on here, rectus femoris is performing flexion of hip, extension of knee. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus are performing extension of the hip, flexion of the knee. Sartorius is the only one that performs the same action on both hip and knee. If you notice, rectus femoris, one flexion, one extension. Biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus, one extension, one flexion. The only one that performs flexion on both hip and knee is the sartorius. Again, why? Because it travels from the anterior aspect to the posterior aspect of the body. So it travels anterior to the hip joint, but posterior to the knee joint. That's why it is going to be performing flexion on both hip and knee. What other actions the sartorius will be performing? You see on here, I am pulling the insertion towards the origin. So I can perform flexion of hip, flexion of knee, but also I can perform a lateral rotation of the thigh. I am putting here a medial point to a lateral point, so I can rotate the thigh to the outside, away from the midline. lateral rotation of the thigh. Questions? All right, so moving on to the muscles of the leg, starting first with the muscles located in the anterior aspect of the leg. If you see on here, we've got a muscle with a single tendon that is getting its origin from the tibia and will be inserted down here in the first metatarsal bone. So what we call this muscle on here with a single tendon, and it's located in the anterior aspect of the leg, getting its origin from the tibia. It's my tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior. So what do you think is going to be the action of a muscle that gets its origin from the tibia and is inserted down in the foot? So when I pull the foot towards my leg, what action would I be performing? What do we call this movement of the foot? An upward movement of the foot. What do we call this? Upward movement of the foot. It's dorsiflexion, exactly. Dorsiflexion. So tibialis anterior is going to be pulling the foot upwards, allowing dorsiflexion of the foot. Dorsiflexion is corresponding to the extension in the upper limb. So imagine the foot is like your hand. This is the superior surface of your foot. This is the inferior surface of your foot. So dorsiflexion is corresponding to extension in the upper limb. We remove here the tibialis anterior. I want you to look here deeper to the tibialis anterior. I have a muscle that gets its origin also from the tibia, but this time it has 4 tendons going to the 4 lateral toes. So again, dorsiflexion is corresponding to extension. So what do we call this muscle that has 4 tendons going to the lateral 4 toes? We call this is my extensor digitorum. But we've got another extensor digitorum, if you remember, in the upper limb. We've got extensor digitorum in the upper limb. So how come would I be able to differentiate between this one in the leg and the one in my forearm? So the one in the leg is going to be longer. So we call this is my extensor digitorum longus. So if I just mentioned extensor digitorum, what would you understand? You understand that I'm speaking about the one in the forearm, in the posterior aspect of the forearm. But here, when I say extensor digitorum longus, you will understand that I'm speaking of the muscle with 4 tendons located in the anterior aspect of the leg. So what do you think is going to be the action here of the extensor digitorum longus? What do you think? I'm pulling those lateral 4 toes towards my tibia, as well as my foot, the whole foot also with it. So what action am I performing on here for the lateral 4 toes and For the ankle, I'm performing again dorsiflexion. Dorsiflexion of the lateral four toes, and I'm aiding the dorsiflexion of the foot as well. All right, so we don't call the movement extension, but it's corresponding to the extension. But we don't call this movement extension. We call it dorsiflexion, all right? But it corresponds to the extension, but we don't call it extension. Is this clear? All right, so again, what is the action? Yes, it's exclusively dorsiflexion, all right? We don't call it extension. So again, what is the action here of the tibialis anterior? Dorsiflexion of the foot at the ankle. What is the action of the extensor digitorum longus? Is going to be performing dorsiflexion of the lateral four toes, as well as aiding in the dorsiflexion of the foot at the ankle joint. Moving on to our last two muscles. Those are located in the posterior aspect of the leg. Those are the gastrocnemius. As you see, the gastrocnemius is getting its origin from the tibia, gastrocnemius, and will be inserted along with another muscle located deeper to it by a single tendon in the calcaneus. So we're looking here. This is my gastrocnemius, and this is the Achilles tendon or the calcaneal tendon. Deeper to the gastrocnemius, if I remove the gastrocnemius on here, you will see deeper to it, you've got another muscle called the soleus. A soleus doesn't get its origin from the femur, like what we see in the gastrocnemius. It gets its origin from the tibia and fibula. This is for the soleus. Compared to the gastrocnemius is getting its origin from the femur. So it's going to be traveling both behind the knee and behind the ankle. So traveling behind the knee, the gastrocnemius will allow flexion of knee. Traveling behind the ankle joint is going to be performing plantar flexion. So gastrocnemius action is going to be flexion of the knee and plantar flexion of the foot at the ankle. Compared to the soleus, which is located deeper to the gastrocnemius, as you see on here, the soleus only going to be passing behind the ankle joint, so it's only going to be aiding in the plantar flexion. So can you imagine on here, when I pull on the calcaneus, I pull the calcaneus upwards. I'm pulling the calcaneus upwards. The foot itself is going to be moving down. And if you remember, the downward movement of the foot is called plantar flexion. Questions? All right, so this completes our discussion for the muscles and all the important muscles that you're gonna need to know for the upcoming lab exam. So let me go with you over Where can you find the review documents, and where do we study from for this upcoming lab exam? So we're going to find all the information related to the muscles in module number 3, module 3. Those are the PowerPoints for the lectures that we've covered so far. We've covered already chapter 9 and chapter 10. Completed today chapter 10. You have those Q-banks for the chapters, both 9 and 10, we're done with them. I highly recommend you to get those done. You will find the PowerPoint presentations that we have been working from, those one on here, those ones. You've got them in 2 parts. You have muscles part 1 and muscles part 2. And in a form of a list, like what you've seen in the bones lab exam. You've got a list of the important muscles and the information you need to know about those muscles. So you're going to be tested only about the information stated in this list. So if the muscle, for example, has an action, so you're required to know the action that is stated on the list. If the muscle has an origin, you need to know the origin for this muscle. If you have an insertion, you need to know the insertion for this muscle, and so on. So you don't have origin, insertion, and action for every single muscle, but for the ones that you have, you need to know them. So how would you be addressing the question on the actual exam? On the exam, you're going to have questions similar to those ones. So you're going to have a diagram either from the textbook, those are the diagrams from the textbook, or from visible body. And I will be giving you a list of choices for muscle identification. So I might ask you to identify the muscle or to state the action of the muscle. So you're going to be picking the action of this specific muscles that is marked, or to mention the origin, or to mention the insertion of the muscle. So you have 4 types of questions that you might be tested with in this upcoming lab exam. So you have identify the muscle, state the action, state the origin, state the insertion. All right. In some cases, you're going to have important tendons. We like Achilles tendon, the calcaneal tendon, and the gala aponeurotica. Those are important tendons. Linea alba. So those are not muscles, but you're still required to know them. So you're going to find them on the list as well. So muscles lab practice exam. Again, please use this as your guide to practice for this upcoming lab exam. You will not find a key answer for this, for those questions to help with the identification, but those are diagrams retrieved from the visible body courseware. So I highly recommend you, if you couldn't figure out one of those muscles because it doesn't look similar to the ones that you have in the textbook, I highly recommend you to go and check the muscle out from visible body. All right, so when you are not sure of what this muscle is, please go to your visible body and check out the name of the muscle. By this way, you're going to be able to practice and review the information.